Ed Fouhy, F-O-U-H-Y. I was a field producer for the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite on the China trip.
Before you ever went to China as a kid, what were your impressions of China?
Well, I suppose China was a very remote place where a lot of Christian missionaries were constantly coming and going, and they'd come to the church to raise money. And my mother was a very devout Catholic, and she'd send whatever meager money she could afford to the Mary Knoll missions in China. So we got a little magazine, and when I was a boy growing up, written by the Mary Knoll missions, and I knew only what I read in the Mary Knoll missionary magazine.
So when you went there, what were your first impressions upon arriving?
Well, going there as an adult in 1972 was a remarkable experience. It was like flying to the moon, because Westerners, or at least Americans, hadn't been there since about 1948 or 49. So it was, whatever it was, 23, 24 years since anyone had been there in a journalistic role. And so it was a totally unknown society. And I remember landing and just throwing my stuff in the room, and with a camera crew going out on the street just to see what we could find, because everything was new to an American audience. And we found this remarkable, at least I thought it was remarkable at the time, institution that they have in China when the children come home from school, and how they're regimented. And we did a little story called The Human School Bus, about how the children would walk and with one adult, and as they came to their home, the kid would peel off and that sort of thing. It was like being on a school bus but without the bus, and it turned out to be a terrific little story that ran on the evening news the next night.
Talk about advanced preparations before you went, dealing with the White House, press people, and the Chinese to set up arrangements. How did that all work out?
The White House, when Nixon was president, had a press office that was very well organized, and everything ran on time. I had covered a Nixon's around the world trip a year or two before, I think maybe in '68 or '69. And I remember, we were on that trip for maybe 10, 12 days, and what they call the Bible, which is the schedule of events that came out, it was handed to us at Bowling, what's the name of the big Air Force base in Washington?
Andrews?
Pardon?
Andrews?
Andrews. The Bible, the White House Bible, the schedule of what was going to happen on that round the world trip, they only deviated once from that, and that was only by 30 minutes. So it was extremely well organized. The real question was what was going to happen. And that was kind of shrouded in mystery. I don't think they wanted to raise expectations. Kissinger did a briefing, a backgrounder. Kissinger was always doing briefings and backgrounders, and being kind of the informed source. And we knew about that. And also CBS had hired a couple of China scholars to come in and several weeks before we left, and to do backgrounders. But even the scholars really were feeling in the dark. They didn't know a lot about the power structure in China, because it was so difficult for any independent scholar or journalist to get in there.
Buddy, who was a journalist at the time, wanted to go on the trip. How was that negotiated and decided who would go?
That was negotiated by an advance group that went over to China at least a month before we left. See, Nixon the trip had been announced in the summer, so there was a lot of time to prepare for it. And there had been at least one, and possibly more, CBS executives had gone over, and other news executives had gone over to negotiate with the Chinese, and what I later learned was a very difficult environment. The Chinese were very, very limiting in how many journalists were able to go. So on a normal presidential trip in those days, you'd have 150, 200 journalists, some technicians, some other people, not all reporters. But on this trip, the Chinese severely limited the number. I don't remember exactly how many, but I think it was on the order of around 80.
And did some senior executives have to pull rank and come in under the guise of being a technician?
One or two did. I believe Gordon Manning he was the news director of CBS at the time. I think he went in as a technician, right?
And describe the transmission center that you set up, how you got the pictures.
I can't do that for you, Ann. I wasn't there. That was an advanced group that went in about 2 or 3 weeks before the trip, and they literally built a transmission center. I never was there. There was a guy, a very, very talented producer for CBS named Stanhope Gould, who was the supervisor of that, and there were several technical people who supervised it. I can't help you with that, though.
Okay. What do you remember about the flight over?
I remember that we flew to Honolulu and spent the night there, and then we flew on to Midway. And Nixon had a major announcement in Midway, which turned out to be what they call the Nixon Doctrine. He held a press conference at as I remember, Navy Officers Club on Midway, and talked about what the United States foreign policy was going to be going forward. Then spent the night on Midway and left, as I remember, from Midway for Shanghai.
And talk about on your audio diary that you sent, describing the mood as you're moving into Shanghai.
Oh, well, everybody on the press plane, certainly I was, and I think I could speak for the others as well, was excited to be going to China. This was, it was going to be a good story, and that's what animates journalists, is a really good story. And secondly, we were going someplace that no one had ever been before, in effect. The press plane was full of people who were operating at the top of their game, covering the White House, covering it on a major foreign policy development like this. And I think that it was, the air of anticipation was palpable.
You were assigned a government minder from the Chinese government.
Did you want me to talk about the recording the air traffic control thing, or not?
Sure, yeah.
I didn't know if you were getting at that in the last
no,
question or
I
not.
it was just sort of the suspense of going to this place and the fact that you even recorded that is interesting.
Oh, okay, yeah.
To talk a little bit about that.
There was a real sense of going to some place that people hadn't been to, certainly in a very long time. So I sat down with the skipper of the press charter, who is a very experienced captain with Pan American, which was the operator of that plane, and asked him if I could ride up front on the flight deck going into China, because as you know, the international aviation language is English. And it was interesting to me as to whether or not the Chinese would answer in English when the pilot contacted them for instructions about landing. And he said, sure. So I rode up front with the pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer with a tape recorder and recorded the exchange between the crew and Chinese air traffic control, which of course did speak English. And that became a very good radio story for us on the day before the president landed.
And you were assigned a government minder. What was that experience
Correct.
like? What was that relationship?
It was a difficult relationship because, if you recall, the Cultural Revolution was going on at that time. So it was very difficult to get the minder to be anything but a sort of animated robot. It was a he, and as the week went on, and as we got to know him a little bit better, he loosened up a little bit. But there was a real sense that this guy was not just a translator and a minder, but he really was an intelligence agent, I felt.
Did you meet any other Chinese when you were there?
No, no.
And describe how you handled the live coverage of Nixon's arrival. Were the cameras set up? And you talked a little bit about Cronkite not knowing what Mrs. Nixon's coat was going to be.
Air Force One came in a day after we had landed, and so we were taken out to the airport where he was going to land, and it was not a particularly cold day. It was a sunny day, as I remember, fairly windy, but the weather wasn't bad for that part of China in February. We were standing on a bleacher, like you'd see at a high school football stadium. And normally, of course, Cronkite doing a live broadcast would be surrounded by people and would have a place to sit and have his notes and so on. But he didn't. There were just the two of us. I was off camera. He told me just before the plane pulled up to a stop, he told me, and the engines were running, so he had to shout. He said, I'm colorblind. Tell me what color Pat Nixon's coat is, if it's either green or pink, because I'm colorblind between those two colors. And so I said, fine, and as it happened, she indeed was wearing a pink coat coming off the plane.
And you had a cue card that you held up?
I don't remember. I think I just wrote it on my notebook and held it up so he could see it.
Okay. And how did the live business work? I mean, you were there live. How did that technically work?
You're going to have to ask somebody else that question. I don't know.
Okay. There are a lot of big names on this trip. Cronkite, Dan Rather, Kalb, others. Was there jostling for airtime? Was there competition about who was going to get what?
No, not really, because Kalb was not on the trip. For CBS, it was Seufert, Cronkite, Rather. I don't remember that there was anybody beyond them, those three. There was not really a lot of competition because everywhere we looked there was a story, and the folks back in New York were eager for anything that we would send them for both the morning and the evening program. I think it was perhaps the first time ever that an anchorman had gone out into the field. And so it was Russ Bensley, who was the executive producer of the broadcast at the time, pretty much dedicated the whole broadcast to Nixon in China for the first 2, maybe 3 nights. Then other events started to occur and to impinge on the airtime. But it was really not difficult for them to get on the air.
What was their interaction with the White House like? What was it like working with them? Were they helpful? Were they stage managing the whole thing?
Oh yeah, they were stage managing everything. They Haldeman, who was one of Nixon's closest aides, had been an advertising man, and right from the very first time I ever covered any Nixon campaign, it was clear that Haldeman was an expert at and a great devotee of television. And so he was constantly thinking about setting up pictures. And if you look at the coverage, what's devoted to the meeting between Nixon and Mao, all that's available is a black and white picture. But in order to fill that airtime, there was the trip to the Great Wall, there was Mrs. Nixon at the panda pen at the zoo, there was Nixon doing various things in a picturesque setting, so that we were able to transmit a story that was full of wonderful pictures, and hopefully the commentary was telling people what else was going on.
Did any real news come out of it? No daily briefings or anything substantive that you could?
There were certainly briefings. There were briefings as to, so the White House could put their spin on what had happened. I mean, it really was very important for Mao and Nixon to make this rapprochement, essentially securing the Chinese security because of the Russians being on their border, and a very tense border it was. So I think that that meeting was very, very substantive. The later meetings that Nixon had with Chou Enlai and the other Chinese officials, not so.
And do you think that you captured any of the real China while you were there?
No. No, I think we saw a Potemkin village that was carefully stage managed, probably a joint effort by the Chinese and the White House.
What was your reaction when Nixon was taken off to meet with Mao? Kind of a.
I didn't know about it.
No, and no one did. What was your?
I don't
reaction
think
after
anybody knew about it.
Was there resentment that you weren't?
Yes, yeah, there was enormous resentment. Why did we come all this way and we couldn't cover the whole purpose of the trip? I don't think we knew the meeting had taken place until the Communist Party daily newspaper came out with a picture on the front page of the two men standing looking at one another.
Interesting. Interesting way to find out the news. Did you talk to Nixon's press people about this, or do you think this is something that?
Oh yes, yeah. Vigorous discussions about
yes,
that. Yeah.
I want to go into that a little.
They brushed this off.
Okay. And how much tension was there between newspaper folks and TV folks?
Well, there was always some. but I don't remember it being particularly difficult in any way. You'd probably be better off asking the newspaper people. I think that there was some resentment because they thought that the networks had a lot of people compared to what they were allowed to, the number of visas they were given. So there may have been some of that, but you know, that was certainly very gentlemanly.
And tell us the story of Diane Sawyer's pantyhose.
Well, we were leaving the hotel where we had spent a couple of nights in Beijing because we were going to take a night flight to the next stop on the trip. And it was cold that night, and the bus was getting ready to leave. We were all on the bus, and just as the bus was ready to leave for the airport, a Chinese guy came running out of the hotel, and he had a pantyhose, and he was clearly agitated. He thought someone had left this behind in their room. Well, it was Diane Sawyer who came forward in the bus to claim that, but I guess she had just thrown them away. I don't know. But in those dark days in China, a poverty-stricken country still, the notion that somebody would throw away a perfectly good pair of pants just didn't cross this guy's radar screen at all.
And what was her role there?
She was an assistant in the press office.
She worked for the White House.
She worked for the White House, correct.
And ABC sent Barbara Walters, who had no foreign affairs experience. What was your view of her being there?
Barbara Walters was always very tough competition, very tough. And frankly, I remember being very concerned that she was going to get something that the rest of us were not. She was on pretty good terms with both the President and the First Lady, and she probably had other sources as well, but we kept a close eye on her.
And what were the mechanics of going from the Great Wall in the middle of winter? And what about Cronkite's heated shoes?
It was a particularly warm day and a sunny day when we went out to the Great Wall to get what turned out to be a grand photo opportunity. My recollection is that there was a bus that took us out there at a decent hour of the morning, like 8 or 9 o'clock, and the President came an hour or so later after we had had a chance to set up, and he paraded down the Great Wall with Mrs. Nixon and a whole group of Chinese and American officials. And Cronkite had, in anticipation of the really cold weather, in fact, CBS had issued us very nice coats and hats and long underwear because it was going to be so cold in China, boots. But Cronkite had a pair of electric socks like a duck hunter would wear, and the socks kept shorting out on him. I think he finally took the batteries out of his sock.
What kind of, with the benefit of hindsight now, what kind of image of China did the TV coverage create for the U.S. audience?
What did it create for the Chinese or
the U.S. audience?
For the U.S. audience of China or of the Nixon presidency?
What you did was the first view people in this country had of the States.
Yeah.
So what role did you feel like you had in creating that image?
I think a major role, because this was a major news story. It was at a time when routinely the evening news was getting a 30 share. The CBS Evening News was getting a 30 share, and NBC was probably doing very well at the time, and ABC was as well. So I think this was the first impression that the American television viewer was getting of this forbidden society that had been behind this bamboo curtain for many years, 2 decades at that time or more. And I think as I said before, I think we saw a Potemkin village, but it was exactly the message the Chinese, our interests in the Chinese really were the same. We were interested in a good story, and there was plenty of substance in the trip, but they put on a sort of a primer, a China 101 for American television viewers.
And how do you think that changed people's minds? I mean, China was the Red Menace, and it was scary, and it was dark and foreign, and then all of a sudden it was the flavor of the month.
I don't think that one event would have changed decades of Cold War rhetoric. decades of the Red Menace coming from Asia, the combat between Chinese and American soldiers and Marines in Korea was still fresh in people's minds. It was not that long ago. And of course, the Chinese had played a sort of a stage manager role during the Vietnam War as well.
So you don't think it changed people's impressions of China?
I would be very skeptical that any one event will do that. I'm sure there's public opinion data that's available for that period of time, and maybe there was a blip that maybe Mao's popularity rating went from 0 to 10, but I'd be skeptical of that.
And do you think that TV coverage got any handle on what was really going on in China at the time? Any sense of, was there any reporting about the Cultural Revolution or anything?
When we got to Shanghai, it became very clear that there was the Cultural Revolution was on the verge of being out of control. The Cultural Revolution people in Shanghai made it very clear that what was going on in Beijing was not necessarily what was going on in Shanghai. Because I don't speak Chinese, and I'm certainly not an expert in China, I was frankly puzzled by that. But I think sophisticated viewers, scholars, and people who know a lot more about China than I do would have been struck by certain evidence that the Cultural Revolution was at a stage that perhaps we had not known before.
Give me an example of what you saw or what you heard.
Well, what I can tell you is that at probably 2 o'clock in the morning, the door to my hotel room in Shanghai sprang open, and the lights were flicked on, and 2 Chinese men came into the room, and they harangued me for 10 or 15 minutes in Chinese. I had no idea what was going on. And then they presented me with a great big box, which turned out to be a box of candy. And of course, then they turned around and left. And I had no idea what that was about, and I started asking around the next morning, and people said, well, that was the Red Guards for Shanghai, and they were kind of just flexing their muscles and letting you know that you're in Shanghai, you're in their territory now, not in Beijing. But I would leave it to the sinologists to put all that together.
And could you imagine then what China has become now?
No, no way. China was a very, very backward society. Beijing was a small city. I don't think there was a single building over 3 or 4 stories high. Shanghai had the remnants of the colonial occupation, so that there was some architecture of merit there, and particularly along the river, but no, I can't even begin to imagine it.
And what was your favorite food when you were there?
I like Chinese food. I think I ate everything, but after a while it became over the top. I later learned that the best Chinese chefs from all over the country had been summoned to prepare the food for the Westerners that came in. And it was certainly wonderful food, and I enjoyed it, but the crew of the Pan Am Press Charter served us hamburgers and hot dogs on the way out of Shanghai, and a hot dog never tasted better.
Okay, I think that's it. Anything else you want to add that you think?
I think we've covered it all.
Okay. Perfect. That's my problem.
And you know.
Yep.
At least something that they can play around with.
Well, now you don't worry about jump cuts because you just dissolve.
I know.
All
Yeah.
those old tricks.